I've done a lot of camping over the years, enough that most situations out in the woods don't rattle me anymore. I've woken up to coyotes howling close to camp, had bears come through looking for scraps, gotten turned around in thick brush more than once. I've dealt with bad storms, freezing nights, even falling trees during high winds. But nothing, not a single one of those things, ever hit me with the kind of fear I felt the day I realized just how close I was to real danger. Not from animals, not from the weather, but from another person. It was supposed to be a simple hunting trip. I packed light: shotgun, vest, shells, a cooler with food, my tent, and enough gear to spend a couple of nights out. The plan was to park off a dirt road, hike in a few miles, set up camp, and work the surrounding ridges for upland birds. I'd been to that area before and knew the land well enough to move with confidence. The air was cool, the sun strong but not too hot, the kind of fall day where you felt glad just to be outside. I spent the morning walking through sage flats and brushy draws, listening for the flutter of wings, the sudden lift of quail breaking cover. The ground crunched beneath my boots, and the smell of dust and pine drifted together in the breeze. It was quiet out there, too quiet, in fact. I hadn't seen another hunter since I left the truck, which struck me as odd since it was the weekend, but I shrugged it off and kept going. Around midday, I decided to take a shortcut through a shallow valley to reach another section of ground that usually held birds. The valley was shaded and narrow, the trail cutting through thick willows and tall grass. It wasn't a place where you could see far ahead, but it seemed like the fastest way to go. I moved slowly, eyes scanning, shotgun relaxed in my hands. That's when I saw him. He was standing right in the middle of the trail, 30 yards ahead, facing me directly. In his hands was an AR-15 held tight at the ready, not slung across his chest, not hanging loose. Up, gripped, aimed down but ready to swing up in an instant. The sight of it froze me cold. My legs stiffened, my breath caught, and in that split second every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong. He wasn't dressed like a hunter. No orange, no vest, no gear. His clothes were filthy, torn, layered like he'd been sleeping in them for days. His beard was ragged, his face hollow, his skin stretched tight across his cheekbones. He looked like he hadn't bathed or shaved in weeks, maybe months. He didn't look healthy. He looked strung out, worn thin, like the kind of man you'd cross the street to avoid if you saw him in town. And here he was, out in the bush with a rifle he had no legal reason to be carrying. My stomach twisted hard. I kept my shotgun angled low, doing everything I could not to look like a threat. I forced myself to stand calm even though my chest felt like it was being squeezed by a vice. I couldn't see anyone else around him, but the brush was thick. For all I knew, he wasn't alone. The silence was unbearable. He stared, and I felt his eyes crawling over me, sizing me up. I tried to look relaxed, like this was nothing unusual, though inside I was calculating every possible move. What cover was nearby, how far it was back to open ground, what chance I'd have if things went bad. Time seemed to stretch. Finally, he shifted, his face twitching with something I couldn't read. Then he told me he was hunting deer. The words sounded flat, almost careless, but the way he said them carried a weight I didn't miss. Deer season wasn't open. An AR-15 wasn't legal for hunting deer anyway, and he didn't look like any deer hunter I'd ever met. He looked more like a man with nothing to lose. Every part of me knew I was standing in a place I wasn't supposed to be. I shouldn't have come through that valley. I shouldn't have crossed his path. And now the only thing keeping this from turning bad was how I handled the next minute. I nodded slightly, steady as I could, and asked where I might find some birds. My voice sounded thin even to me, like it didn't belong to the body I was standing in. His answer came after a long pause, his tone sharpening when he told me I might find them back the way I came. That was it. No room for argument. No invitation to keep moving forward. Just a clear, sharp message. Turn around and leave. And I did. Slowly, carefully, I backed away, my boots dragging against the dirt, my shotgun never lifting above my waist. Every step felt heavy, my heart thudding in my ears. His rifle never lowered. He just watched, rigid, until the brush began to close between us. The moment I was out of sight, I turned and moved fast, not running outright but close to it. My shoulders felt exposed, like a target waiting for a round to hit. I didn't know if he was still standing there, if he was following me, or if someone else was in the brush ready to cut me off. My only thought was to put as much distance as I could between me and that spot. When I finally broke out of the valley and climbed back onto higher ground, I let out a shaky breath. My chest felt hollow, my legs rubbery. The world around me, the sky, the trees, the open ridges, looked the same as before, but it all felt different now, darker, hostile. I couldn't enjoy the quiet anymore. The quiet felt threatening. I cut a wide loop back to the truck, staying alert, checking my back trail every few steps. When I reached it, I tossed my gear inside without caring how it landed, started the engine, and drove until I was miles away. Only then did I realize how badly my hands were shaking. That night, I replayed everything in my head. The way he stood on the trail, the way his eyes locked on me, the way his words sharpened when he told me to turn back. The conclusion was impossible to ignore. If that man had wanted to kill me, there was nothing stopping him. I was alone, out of sight, with no cell service, no witnesses. He could have pulled the trigger, and no one would have found me until someone happened across my body days later. I went to the sheriff's office the next day and reported what happened. I gave them the exact location, described him, described the weapon. They wrote it down, nodded, asked a few questions. I don't know if they ever went out there, if they found anything, or if they just let it slide. I never heard back, but for me, the message stuck. Out in the backcountry, you're on your own. You can do everything right, know the rules, carry the gear, and still stumble into a situation that could end you in a second. That man wasn't out there for deer. He wasn't out there for anything good. I crossed into something I wasn't supposed to see, and the only reason I walked away was because I acted like nothing was wrong, played it calm, and took the hint. Even now, when I think about that valley, I feel the same chill in my gut. It wasn't the wilderness that scared me that day. It was the reminder that people are the most unpredictable danger you can meet out there. And sometimes survival doesn't come from the gear you carry or the skill you've built. It comes from knowing when to leave, when to swallow your pride, when to turn back before it's too late. I've been in plenty of strange spots while out hunting and camping, but there's one day that has stayed with me more than almost anything else. It wasn't about bad weather or a run-in with a wild animal. It was about a person, and the kind of feeling that takes hold of you when you realize in a split second how quickly things could go wrong. The day started out simple. I woke early, made coffee, packed up my vest with shells, water, and some snacks, and slung the shotgun across my shoulder. It was upland bird season, and I had been looking forward to covering some ground. The air was cool, the sky wide and clear, and the light coming over the ridges had that crisp autumn sharpness that makes the world feel fresh and alive. I parked the truck along a dirt road and headed in on foot, working the brush, cutting through sage, and scanning ahead for any sign of birds. My boots crunched in the dirt, the smell of dust and pine mixing together in the breeze. I was in good spirits, relaxed, and enjoying the quiet. After a few hours, I decided to cut through a shallow valley as a shortcut to another area I liked. The valley was shaded, the willows thick around the narrow trail, and the air felt cooler down there. I remember thinking it would be an easy walk through and then I'd be back in the open, covering more ground. But halfway through, I stopped dead. There was a man standing right in the middle of the trail ahead of me. He was holding an AR-15, not slung on his shoulder, not carried loosely, but tight in his hands, up at the ready. The sight of him hit me like a punch to the stomach. My body froze, every hair on my neck standing up at once. It was the kind of instant, gut-deep alarm that you can't explain, only feel. He didn't look like a hunter. His clothes were filthy, layered like he'd been living out there for days. His beard was patchy, his face gaunt, his skin gray and unhealthy. He looked worn down, hollow, like the kind of person who hadn't bathed, shaved, or slept properly in a long time. His eyes were hard, restless, watching me, and in his hands was a rifle he had no legal reason to be carrying out there. I was scared out of my skin, but I knew I couldn't let it show. I kept my shotgun angled down, not in any way that looked threatening, and tried to stand steady. Inside, though my chest was pounding, my throat dry, I thought about how fast things could turn if he decided I wasn't supposed to be there. Out there, no one would hear a thing. I managed to ask where I might find some birds, hoping he would take the hint, say something that would let me leave without pushing the wrong button. My voice sounded too calm for how I felt. Maybe that was what saved me. He just looked at me for a long moment before telling me I might find some back the way I had come. The way he said it wasn't advice, it was an order. That was my way out, and I took it. Slowly, carefully, I backed away, every step heavy, my shotgun low, my body screaming to move faster but my mind forcing me to stay calm. His rifle never lowered. He just stood there watching, as if deciding something in his head. When the brush finally closed between us and I was out of sight, I turned and moved quick, my boots kicking dust as I pushed out of that valley. Every sound made me jump. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. I didn't know if he was following or if someone else was in the brush, waiting. All I knew was I had to get out. By the time I climbed back onto higher ground, my legs felt like rubber. The valley behind me looked quiet and empty, but it felt poisoned now, a place I didn't want to ever see again. I cut a wide loop back to my truck, checking my back trail every few steps, my ears straining for anything out of place. When I finally saw my truck, the relief was so strong it nearly buckled me. I tossed my gear in without caring how it landed, started the engine, and drove until I was miles away. My hands were still shaking on the wheel. I couldn't believe how calm I had seemed while it was happening, because inside I had been terrified. I kept thinking about how easily it could have gone another way. Out there, if that man had decided to lift his rifle, there was nothing I could have done. He could have pulled the trigger, left me there, and no one would have known for days. I was surprised it had happened at all. I was surprised I had managed to keep my voice even, to act like nothing was wrong, when every part of me was on fire with fear, and I was surprised nothing came of it. No shot, no struggle, just that sharp order to turn back and the long, shaky walk out of there. The next day, I told the sheriff about it. I gave them the location, described the man and the weapon, and let them take it from there. I never heard what became of it. Maybe they checked and found nothing. Maybe he moved on. Maybe he's still out there, standing on some trail, rifle in hand, waiting for the next unlucky person to come through. For me, it was a lesson burned deep. Out in the wild, you expect to deal with the elements, the animals, the chance of getting lost or injured. But the scariest thing I've ever faced wasn't any of that. It was another person, broken down, unpredictable, and armed. That day reminded me how thin the line can be. A single word, a single wrong move, and it could have ended right there in the dirt. The only thing that saved me was staying calm, acting friendly, and leaving the way I came. It's not a moment I'll ever forget, and it's not one I want to repeat. Even now, when I head into the bush, I think about it. I check my routes more carefully. I keep my eyes open not just for animals, but for people, because sometimes people are the real danger out there. And I remember just how close I came to not making it out at all. I remember that week in the woods like it was yesterday. It was supposed to be one of the highlights of my time in the Boy Scouts, one of those week-long camps where you learn skills, push yourself, and come back home with a little more confidence than you left with. I had signed up to complete the Wilderness Survival Merit Badge, and part of that meant building my own shelter and spending a night in it, away from the base camp. On paper, it sounded exciting. In reality, it had my nerves twisted into knots from the moment I read the requirement. There were about 8 of us working on that badge, and the adults had it set up so we'd hike out a couple miles from the main camp, pick a spot in the woods, and build makeshift shelters. No tents, no easy comforts, just whatever we could piece together with branches, leaves, and rope. It wasn't that far from the main site, but once you were out there, surrounded by forest, it felt like a world away. I was already a naturally anxious kid, and the days leading up to it only made things worse. I tried to act like I wasn't bothered, smiling along when the other guys talked tough about how they were going to build the best lean-to, or how they hoped they'd see a bear just to prove they could handle it. Inside, though, I was running through every possible bad scenario. I thought about mountain lions. I thought about snakes slipping into my shelter. I thought about waking up to someone missing or finding tracks of something huge nearby. When the night came, we packed our little day bags with the bare essentials and followed one of the adult leaders out into the woods. He guided us to an area that was fairly flat, tucked away near a small clearing with enough fallen branches and natural materials to work with. Once we got there, he gave us some last instructions, told us he'd see us in the morning, and then left us standing there with just the sound of crickets and the distant creak of trees swaying in the wind. The first thing we all did was spread out a little, each of us picking a spot to build our shelters. You didn't want to be too close to anyone else, but you also didn't want to be way off by yourself. I chose a spot not far from another boy, close enough that I could see his shelter through the trees, but not close enough that we could talk without raising our voices. The work of gathering branches, layering them, and making the shelter sturdy enough took a couple hours. By the time I finished, sweat was dripping down my back even though the night was cooling off. When I finally crawled inside, it was cramped but functional. The ground was hard, and I could feel rocks pressing into my shoulder blades even after I cleared as many as I could, but at least it felt somewhat secure. That was the thing. I kept reminding myself this was just one night, and then it would be over. Just one night. Lying there, though, it was impossible to relax. Every noise seemed amplified. Leaves rustling sounded like footsteps. A snapping twig could have been anything from a squirrel to a bear. My heart would speed up, and I tried to control my breathing so I didn't sound panicked. Sleep came in waves. I'd drift off for a few minutes, only to wake up again at the slightest sound. At some point deep into the night, when the forest felt like it had swallowed every bit of light and time seemed to crawl, it happened. From the shelter a short distance away, I suddenly heard shouting. At first, I thought I dreamed it, but then it came again, louder, desperate. A voice cut through the night, frantic and terrified. "No, please, get away. Stop. Don't." My whole body froze. The words were sharp, clear, and filled with panic. My heart slammed against my chest, and my throat went dry. I shot upright inside my little shelter, crouching low and straining to see through the dark. My mind instantly went to the worst possible scenario. Someone had come into our camp. Someone dangerous. I whisper shouted, as loudly as I dared, "Hey!" hoping to snap whoever it was out of the situation or maybe alert the others. But there was no response. The shouting stopped as suddenly as it began, replaced by silence so heavy it pressed down on me. I sat there, staring into the dark, waiting for something to happen. Footsteps, more yelling, anything. Nothing came. What unnerved me even more was that no one else seemed to stir. The other boys in their shelters didn't say a word. Nobody called out, nobody moved. It was like I was the only one who heard it. I kept whispering little hello-s into the dark, hoping someone would answer, but nothing came back. Minutes crawled by. My breathing was too loud in my ears. I could feel sweat dripping down my back even though the air was cool. My mind played out every possible version of what could have happened. Was someone being dragged away? Was there a wild animal? Was someone hurt? Finally, after sitting there in terrified silence, I pieced it together. The boy in the other shelter must have been sleep-talking, or worse, having a night terror. It made sense. He probably didn't even realize what he was doing. But at that moment, the fear had felt real. The tone of his voice, the desperation, it wasn't the kind of thing you forget. Even after I convinced myself of that, I couldn't relax. I lay there the rest of the night, eyes wide open, ears straining, waiting for any other noise. I couldn't believe no one else woke up. How could they have slept through it? The volume, the intensity, it was burned into my head. When morning finally came, the forest looked ordinary again, like nothing had happened. The others were groggy but cheerful, stretching and joking about how their shelters held up. Nobody mentioned hearing anything strange. I thought about saying something, but the words caught in my throat. Felt like no one would believe me, or maybe they'd laugh it off. So I stayed quiet. Even now, years later, I can still hear that panicked voice in my head. I can still feel that icy rush of fear, sitting in the dark woods, convinced for a few minutes that we were about to be attacked, that something terrible was happening just a few feet away. The strangest part of it all wasn't even the shouting. It was the silence that followed, the way it seemed like I was the only one who experienced it. Looking back, I know it must have been night terrors. I know there was no real danger. But in that moment, in that lonely little shelter with nothing but thin branches between me and the forest, it felt like life or death. It was the longest night of my life, and it changed the way I thought about fear. Sometimes, it's not the real threats that get you. It's the moments your mind convinces you the worst is happening, and you're powerless to stop it. That night taught me something I'll never forget. Fear doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it grows inside your head, feeds on your own imagination, and leaves you shaken long after the danger is gone. And even now, when I think about those words, "No, please, get away, stop, don't," I still get the same chill down my spine I felt all those years ago, lying awake in the woods, waiting for something that never came. I had been planning the trip for weeks, checking maps, tuning up the old shotgun, going through my bird vest, boots, and gear. Upland bird season had just opened, and I wanted to cover as much ground as I could before the weather turned rough. The area I picked was a mix of sagebrush flats and wooded ridges out in the backcountry. It wasn't far from home, but far enough off the beaten track that I could wander for hours without running into another soul. At least that was the idea. That morning I parked my truck off a dirt road and walked in, moving slow and steady, scanning for signs of birds. The sun was still climbing, the light cutting sharp across the tops of the brush. The air had that crisp, dry feel, the kind you only get in fall when the nights are cold and the days still hold warmth. I worked a ridge line, checked a draw, and decided to drop through a shallow valley as a shortcut toward another area I knew. It looked simple enough on the map. As I started down into the low ground, the air grew still. The valley floor was shaded, the brush thicker, and the trail that cut through it was narrow, pressed in by willows and scrub. My boots crunched lightly over the dirt, shotgun in one hand, and the smell of damp leaves hung in the air. It should have been uneventful, but halfway through I saw movement ahead. At first I thought it was just another hunter, maybe someone who'd had the same idea as me. But the second I saw the way he was standing, everything in me went rigid. He was right in the middle of the trail, facing me, holding an AR-15 in a ready position. Not slung over his shoulder, not lowered, but up and tight like he was already prepared to use it. I froze without meaning to, my body stiff, and every hair on the back of my neck stood up. The feeling was instant, an alarm bell ringing inside me before my mind had fully caught up. Something was wrong. The man didn't look like any hunter I'd ever seen. He was gaunt, probably in his 50s, with a hollow face and sunken eyes. His clothes were filthy, torn in places, layered like he'd been sleeping rough for days. His beard was patchy, streaked with gray, and he had the kind of skin that looked weathered not from work outdoors, but from neglect. He looked like he hadn't bathed in weeks. Everything about him screamed desperation, instability, danger, and in his hands was a rifle that had no place out there. I tried to keep my body calm, though my stomach twisted and my chest felt like it was tightening with every second. The trail between us was maybe 30 yards, close enough that any wrong move could turn bad immediately. I forced myself to look as casual as I could, keeping my shotgun angled down, not threatening. My mind raced. Deer season wasn't open, and even if it was, an AR-15 wasn't legal for deer hunting in this state. He wasn't dressed like a hunter, not in blaze orange or proper gear. He looked more like the kind of person you'd see in a mugshot from some meth raid, wiry and twitchy, eyes that didn't rest. For a moment, neither of us moved. The valley felt dead silent, like the air itself was holding its breath. I could feel sweat breaking on my back under my vest, even though it wasn't hot. My fingers tingled, gripping the stock of my shotgun. Then he spoke. His voice carried flat, almost dull, but with an edge under it that made my skin crawl. He said he was hunting deer. The words didn't line up with anything in front of me. Deer season wasn't open. He wasn't dressed for it. His weapon wasn't legal for it. He looked half-starved, unshaven, unstable. Everything about him was wrong, and everything in me knew I shouldn't be there. I tried to think of the right way to step back without showing panic. My pulse was loud in my ears, my breathing shallow. The whole situation felt like a trap I just walked into without realizing it. I imagined what could be just down that trail. Maybe a camp hidden in the brush, maybe other people like him, maybe something worse. Meth lab, squatters, who knew? But the gun in his hands was enough. When he spoke again, his tone changed, sharper. He told me the birds I was looking for could probably be found back the way I came. The way he said it was final. Not a suggestion, not friendly advice, but a clear direction. Leave now. The meaning sank in. He didn't want me going forward. And I didn't want to, not anymore. I nodded once, as steady as I could, and began easing backward. My boots felt heavy, every step slow and deliberate. I kept my shotgun low, my body language non-threatening, though my nerves screamed at me to turn and run. The man didn't lower his rifle. He just stood there, watching, until the brush swallowed the space between us. The second I felt I was out of his line of sight, I turned and moved fast. Not a full sprint, too noisy, too reckless, but a steady, urgent pace, my eyes darting to the sides of the trail, my ears straining for any sound of pursuit. Every snap of a branch made me jolt. I didn't know if he was alone, didn't know if he had people stashed back there. All I knew was I had to get out. When I finally broke free of the valley and back onto higher ground, I let out a shaky breath. My chest hurt from how tight I'd been holding myself. I glanced back again and again, but the trail behind me stayed empty. No figure, no movement, just the wind moving through the brush. I didn't linger. I cut my hunt short, made a wide loop back to the truck, and kept scanning over my shoulder the whole way. By the time I reached it, my hands were still trembling. I threw my gear in, started the engine, and drove until I was miles from that spot. That night, I couldn't shake it. Every detail replayed. The way he stood, the rifle angled, the hollow look in his face, the way his words sharpened when he told me to go back. It wasn't just a chance meeting. It felt like I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see, and the only thing that saved me was taking the hint fast enough. The next day, I reported the encounter to the sheriff's office. I told them exactly where it had happened, described the man, described the rifle, described everything I could. They wrote it down, asked a few questions, and said they'd look into it. But I never heard back. Maybe they drove out there and found nothing. Maybe the guy moved on. Maybe he's still out there, standing on some trail with that rifle, waiting. All I know is I won't ever forget the feeling in my gut the moment I saw him. It wasn't like spotting another hunter or running into a hiker. It was like walking face first into a wall of danger, raw and undeniable. My instincts screamed at me, and I listened. Since then, I've hunted the same general region, but I avoid that valley completely. I stick to higher ground, open places where I can see further. And every time I head out, I remind myself, sometimes the real danger in the backcountry isn't the animals you're after. It's the people you don't expect to find. I was driving along Highway 395 late in the afternoon, somewhere deep in the Sierra Nevada. The sun was dipping low, the light sharp and golden against the mountains, but I didn't have a set place to stop for the night. I'd been on the road since morning, tired of gas stations, tired of rest stops, and I wanted a quiet spot to set up camp. I noticed a small wooden sign for a campground a few miles off the highway. It looked like one of those older places, the kind that doesn't get much traffic anymore, and I figured it would be perfect for a night of peace and quiet before continuing my drive north the next day. The road that led off the highway was narrow and cracked. I followed it through tall pines and granite outcroppings, twisting and turning until it finally opened into a little loop of campsites. The place was empty, completely silent except for the sound of wind pushing through the trees. I scanned the circle. There was just one old car parked crookedly in a space near the back, its paint dull and chipped, windows cloudy like it hadn't moved in a while. It didn't look abandoned, not exactly, but it didn't look like someone was camping nearby either. I pulled into a site across the loop, cut the engine, and sat there for a moment listening. No kids yelling, no other cars, no sound of anyone gathering wood or cooking dinner. It was too quiet. Still, I told myself it was fine. Lots of little campgrounds like this go unnoticed by travelers sticking to the bigger places. I got out, stretched, and started unloading my gear. The air was crisp, cooling fast as the sun slid lower. I set up my small tent, drove the stakes into the hard ground, and unrolled my sleeping bag. My plan was simple: cook a quick meal on the camp stove, sit by the fire until it got dark, and turn in early. I had no cell service the moment I turned off the highway, which wasn't unusual in this part of the Sierras. I'd done plenty of camping trips without it. I was just pulling food out of the cooler when I noticed movement at the edge of the trees. A dog stepped out, medium-sized, scruffy, its coat a mix of dark and light patches, ribs faintly visible under its fur. It wasn't wagging its tail or sniffing around like most strays would. It just stood there, maybe 30 feet away, staring at me. I froze. I dealt with stray dogs before, and usually they kept their distance. This one didn't. It just kept its eyes on me, head low, ears pointed forward, not making a sound. I tried ignoring it, went back to what I was doing, but every time I glanced up, it hadn't moved, still staring. Minutes passed, the silence pressing in. Finally, I made a sudden movement, snapped my arms out and shouted at it, trying to scare it off. That's when it exploded into barking. Loud, sharp, echoing barks that ripped through the campground. My heart jumped. It wasn't just the barking, it was what followed. From the direction of that old car across the loop, I heard voices. Male voices, more than one. The sound of someone laughing low, then another voice carrying across the trees. I froze again, my skin crawling. The barking went on, wild, and in the mix of it, I heard one of the men speak louder. His words carried clear across the empty loop, bouncing off the trees. "Oh, we're gonna have some fun tonight." The moment I heard that, my gut turned. I didn't wait. I dropped what I was holding, heart hammering, and moved fast. I yanked the tent stakes out with shaking hands, stuffing everything I could back into the car without any order. My cooler tipped, cans rolling across the dirt. I didn't care. I shoved it in, tossed my pack on top, ripped the tent poles out without even folding them. Every second the dog kept barking, echoing through the trees, the men's voices cutting through now and then. I couldn't tell how many there were, but it wasn't one. I slammed the back of the car shut, scrambled into the driver's seat, and started the engine. My headlights cut across the loop, sweeping past the crooked old car. For a split second, I thought I saw movement beside it, shadows shifting, a figure standing half behind the trunk. Then I was moving, tires spitting gravel, headlights bouncing as I tore back down the cracked road. The narrow stretch out of the campground felt twice as long as before. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles hurt, eyes flicking to the mirrors, half expecting to see headlights chasing me. But the road stayed dark behind me, only the outline of the forest. I didn't let up until I saw the glow of Highway 395 ahead. When I hit the pavement, I finally slowed, but my chest was still tight, my stomach still twisted. I pulled into a turnout down the road and just sat there, engine running, staring into the dark. The dog's barking still rang in my ears, mixed with those voices. I thought about that old car, about how out of place it had looked, about the way the dog had come straight to me, like it knew exactly how to set things in motion. I couldn't shake the idea that it wasn't just some stray. Maybe it was theirs, maybe it was trained to bark on command, to draw attention at the right time. And those men, whether they were squatting there, living out of that car, or just hanging around for reasons I didn't want to know, were close. Too close. I drove another hour north that night before finally pulling into a larger campground near a town. This one had lights, RVs, and families scattered around fires. I didn't even bother setting up again. I just reclined my seat, locked the doors, and tried to rest. Every sound outside, every laugh, every crack of a branch, kept me on edge. Lying there, I kept replaying the moment I heard those words. "We're gonna have some fun tonight." It wasn't a joke, not the way it sounded. It was directed, pointed, and I was the only new thing in that place. By morning, I was still wired. I skipped coffee, skipped breakfast, just got back on the highway and put miles between me and that turnoff. I didn't tell anyone until much later, when the shock wore off. The memory still feels raw. That night taught me something I'll never forget. An empty campground in the middle of the woods isn't always a lucky find. Sometimes it's empty for a reason, and sometimes the people already there aren't the kind you ever want to meet. I've camped a lot since then, but I never again pulled into a deserted spot without thinking about that old car, that dog, and those voices in the dark. I didn't stick around long enough to find out what they meant by fun, and I never will. I have always thought of camping as a way to reset my head. Whenever work or life got too heavy, I'd pack up a tent, a sleeping bag, a few basic supplies, and head somewhere quiet. I liked being away from the noise, away from the constant tug of responsibilities. It gave me the chance to breathe in silence, to notice little things I usually missed. The sound of birds waking up before dawn, the smell of damp grass, the slow changes in the light as the sun dipped and the stars appeared. That night, though, camping gave me something else. It gave me a moment I can't shake, no matter how much time passes. I had gone to a small woodland not too far from the edge of a rural town. It wasn't an official campsite, just one of those spots you come to know if you spend enough time outdoors. A clearing not far from a river, shielded on all sides by trees, flat enough to set up a tent without trouble. I'd been there before and liked it because it felt tucked away, yet not so far off that I felt totally cut off. There was still the faint glow of distant streetlights if you looked hard through the trees, and sometimes the sound of a car on the far-off road if the wind carried it. But mostly it was still. I arrived late afternoon. The sun was already tilting low, spilling long strips of golden light between the trunks. I took my time setting up, pegging my tent firmly, rolling out my mat, organizing my pack so I could find what I needed in the dark. The air smelled of dry leaves and earth, with the river carrying a faint damp chill whenever the breeze turned my way. I ate a simple dinner, just some bread and cheese washed down with water, and then walked a short distance along the riverbank while there was still light. The water was calm, reflecting the last of the sky, and the silence there felt heavier than usual, as if the whole place had been wrapped in a blanket. By the time I returned to my tent, the sky was dimming. I crawled inside, zipped it shut, and laid back in my sleeping bag. I listened to the soft ticking of insects outside, the occasional rustle of something small moving through the undergrowth. I felt at ease. It must have been close to midnight when I woke again. At first, I didn't know what had pulled me out of sleep. My tent was dark, the kind of dark where you can't see the outline of your own hand. I lay still, listening. That's when I heard it. A single sharp crack. Not a twig snapping, not the shifting of branches in the wind. It was heavier, sharper, and my mind placed it before I could even stop myself. A gunshot. I froze. Out there, in the woods, that sound was wrong. Hunting wasn't common in that area, and even if it had been, nobody fired a shot at midnight, not so close to where people lived. My heart started to pound in my chest, and I held my breath, straining to hear more. The night went silent again, so silent that every small sound seemed to grow louder. The creak of my sleeping bag as I shifted, the rush of blood in my ears. I told myself it could have been something else, something ordinary, but even as I thought it, I knew I was lying to myself. Then I heard movement, footsteps, slow, dragging, uneven. They crunched against the ground, then stopped, started again. It was impossible to tell exactly how far away they were, but they were close enough that I could hear the weight of them. I eased the zipper of my tent open just an inch, careful not to make noise, and peered out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the vague outlines of trees. Then, in a gap between them, I saw a figure, a man. He was stumbling, swaying as he moved, and for a moment I thought maybe he was drunk, lost in the woods after a night at some village pub. But then I saw his hands, or more accurately, what one of them held. A shotgun. The breath caught in my throat. He was clutching it loosely, as if his strength had gone, the barrel dragging down toward the ground. His clothes were dark, and in the faint light I couldn't make out much detail, but something about the way he moved was wrong. His head lolled forward, his steps jerky, as if he wasn't fully in control of his body. Then he dropped the weapon. It slipped from his hands, clattering into the grass, and for a second I lost sight of it. That was somehow worse than seeing it in his grip. My mind went wild with possibilities. Had he just shot someone? Was he part of something else entirely? Some kind of execution, a hit gone wrong? The thought hit me so hard I almost gagged. What if there was a body out there in the dark, just beyond where I could see? I felt sweat prickle across my forehead. Every noise seemed louder now. His breathing was ragged, wet somehow, carrying unnaturally in the still night. He staggered forward a few more steps, stopped, swayed, then dropped to his knees. I didn't move. I barely blinked. The sight of him kneeling there, in the middle of the trees with that weapon somewhere in the grass beside him, it rooted me to the spot. I didn't know if he was alive, dying, or something in between. I didn't know if there were others out there watching. Minutes passed, maybe longer. The figure eventually slumped sideways, collapsing into the grass. His body lay still, but I couldn't bring myself to believe it was over. I stayed crouched in my tent, staring out through that small gap, my muscles locked so tight they ached. At some point, the faint orange glow of morning began to bleed into the sky. The trees turned from shadows into shapes, and I could see more clearly. The man was still there, sprawled on the ground, motionless. The shotgun lay a few feet away, half hidden in the grass. I didn't go near him, couldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and leave. I shoved my things into my bag with shaking hands, collapsed the tent as quickly as I could, and left the clearing without looking back. My legs felt weak, like they belonged to someone else, but I forced them to move. When I reached the edge of the woods, I saw the road and the first stirrings of the town beyond. The sight of normal houses, of fences and parked cars, felt surreal after the night I had just lived through. I wanted to tell someone, to knock on a door and explain what I had seen, but the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't explain it properly, not the way it felt. Eventually, I did report it. The police went out there. They found him. It turned out he had tried to take his own life. The shot had torn through his face but hadn't killed him instantly. He had stumbled, dropped the weapon, and collapsed in the woods. I didn't see what happened to him after that. I didn't want to. What I can't forget is the way it felt in that moment. The way my mind spun with possibilities, how I convinced myself I was caught in something darker than suicide, something like a hit, a killing carried out in the middle of the night. The not knowing was the worst. Not knowing if the weapon was still aimed somewhere. Not knowing if others were out there in the dark. Not knowing if I would make it through the night without being dragged into something I couldn't escape. Even now, when I camp, I think of that night. I think of the sound of footsteps, the clatter of the gun hitting the ground, the image of him dropping to his knees under the trees. I remember how small I felt, how powerless, how quickly peace had turned into terror. And I know I'll never hear a gunshot the same way again. I go camping alone often, not because I don't enjoy company, but because solitude in the woods gives me something I can't find anywhere else. Most people I know don't understand it. They think it's boring or dangerous to be out by yourself, with only trees, water, and whatever weather comes your way. But for me, that's the point. It strips things down to the bare bones. No chatter, no distractions, just me, the sound of wind, and the quiet rhythm of a campfire. On this trip, I was 2 days into a solo camp in late autumn. The days were crisp, the nights bit with a cold edge, and the woods were thinning as more leaves gave up their hold and carpeted the ground. I had chosen a spot near a small ridge, tucked back from a faint trail most people didn't bother with. It was far enough from the road that I felt cut off from everything, but close enough that I could hike back if the weather turned. The first night had been calm, uneventful. I made camp, gathered firewood, cooked a small meal, and watched the stars until I felt tired enough to crawl into my tent. I woke with the dawn, stretched sore muscles, and spent most of that day wandering the nearby streams, following deer tracks and listening for birds. There was no rush to anything. I wasn't there to conquer a peak or check something off a list. I was just there to be. The second night, though, reminded me how quickly peace can turn into something that rattles you down to your bones. I had eaten early, a simple meal of rice and jerky cooked over my small stove. By the time the last light faded, the fire had burned down to coals, glowing faintly like a nest of embers tucked into the dirt. The woods had that heavy quiet they get after sunset, the kind where each sound carries farther than it should. A branch snapping half a mile away can sound like it's only yards off. I was sitting on a small folding stool, headlamp dimmed to its lowest setting, jotting notes in a small pocket notebook I always carry. Sometimes I write down what I see. Sometimes I just sketch outlines of the trees or the ridges. I had my back to the fire, staring out into the darkness, letting my ears tune into the night around me. That's when it happened. First, I didn't notice anything, just the faint whisper of leaves shifting with the breeze. Then, behind me, close, too close, I heard something cough. It wasn't the delicate sound of an animal clearing its throat. It was harsh, rough, almost guttural. For half a second, every part of me believed it was a human sound. I froze, pen still in my hand, heart kicking hard against my ribs. The sound had come from no more than a couple feet behind me. That realization alone was enough to send a surge of cold adrenaline racing through me. Nobody should have been there. I was alone, far off from any official campground, and I knew for certain I hadn't heard anyone approach all day. Slowly, carefully, I turned. My headlamp beam caught two bright, glassy eyes staring back at me, reflecting the light like mirrors. For the briefest moment, I thought I was about to come face to face with another person crouched there in the dark. Then the shape became clear. A deer, a young buck, no more than a few years old, standing so close I could have reached out and touched it if I had dared. Its breath fogged faintly in the cold air, and it stood frozen, wide-eyed, just as startled as I was. Relief crashed over me, but it was tangled with something else, something jagged. My body hadn't yet caught up with the reality that it wasn't a person. My brain was still replaying that cough, that human-sounding rasp that had come out of its throat. In the moment before I turned, I had pictured a stranger leaning close, watching me in the dark, waiting for me to notice. That thought had sunk claws into me, and even seeing the deer didn't fully shake it loose. The buck shifted, stamped a hoof, then bounded off into the trees with a violent thrash of leaves. I sat there, still gripping my notebook, my breathing uneven. I knew it was gone, but my nerves didn't settle. My ears stayed tuned to every sound, and now every crack of a branch or brush of leaves against each other felt deliberate, like someone moving just out of sight. I couldn't shake the image of someone sneaking close, holding their breath, waiting until they were only feet away before letting that cough slip. It had sounded too human. That was what kept looping in my head. Animals make all sorts of strange noises. I knew that, but the way that cough had rattled out, deep and ragged, could have come from the throat of a man standing right behind me. I got up and paced the camp, shining my headlamp through the trees, forcing myself to check every angle, every shadow. The light caught on trunks, branches, the silver flicker of spider webs strung low between bushes. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. But that didn't ease the crawling sensation under my skin. I thought about packing up and hiking back in the dark, but reason held me down. The trail was narrow, littered with loose rock and roots, and my chances of twisting an ankle in the night were far greater than running into anyone out there. So I stayed. I stoked the fire, brought it back to life, and sat closer than usual, letting the heat bite at my skin just to remind myself I was still here, still safe. The hours dragged. Each time I felt sleep tugging at me, I'd hear something else. A rustle, a snap, the faint thud of something moving through leaves, and my body would tense all over again. I knew most of it was nothing but small animals, maybe even that same buck circling back, curious. But in the dark, with that cough still echoing in my memory, I couldn't separate harmless from threat. Eventually, exhaustion forced me into the tent. I zipped it shut tight, lay in my bag with my knife tucked close at hand, and stared at the ceiling as if that thin sheet of fabric could keep anything out. My ears stayed awake long after my eyes shut. I must have drifted in and out, because when I finally opened my eyes again, The world outside had gone pale with morning. Birds were calling, and the fire pit was nothing but a gray smear of ash. When I stepped out of the tent, the first thing I did was walk the perimeter of my camp. I looked for prints, signs of anything out of place. I found the marks of hooves in the dirt, fresh enough to confirm it had been the deer, standing alarmingly close before it bolted. That should have been enough to put me at ease. But the unease stayed. I packed up slowly, glancing over my shoulder more often than I needed to. Even as the sun climbed and the woods filled with the ordinary noise of day, I couldn't shake the thought of how easily something or someone had been able to slip right up behind me without a sound. When I finally hiked out, the trail felt different. Each bend in the path, each thicket of brush, felt like a place someone could step out from if they wanted. I kept replaying that moment in my head, the silence behind me, the sudden cough, the certainty I wasn't alone, and it churned in my stomach until I made it back to the road. Back home, telling the story to myself in clearer light, I know it was just a deer. Animals make strange sounds, and I just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time to hear it up close. But when I'm alone in the woods now, I carry that moment with me. I can still feel the way my chest tightened, the way my mind leapt instantly to the worst explanation. And the truth is, I think that reaction is part of what keeps me coming back. Because the woods can give peace, yes, but they can also remind you of how fragile that peace is. It only takes a sound in the dark, one you can't explain, to strip you down to raw fear. And that night, a deer's cough did exactly that. I've been camping most of my life, and over the years I've grown comfortable with being out in the woods alone. I don't mean careless. Anyone who spends real time in the wild knows better than to get sloppy, but comfortable enough that the usual noises of the night don't bother me anymore. A snap of a twig, the call of some animal, even the rush of wind rattling branches. I've learned to recognize those things for what they are. But every so often, something happens that cuts right through that confidence. Something small, maybe something almost silly when you tell it later, but in the moment it can rattle you to your core. That's what happened to me one autumn evening when I camped alone in a stretch of woods I thought I knew well. It had been a long week at work, the kind where every day feels like a copy of the one before, and I decided I needed a reset. I packed my small tent, sleeping bag, stove, and a little food, and drove out to a trailhead I'd used a dozen times before. The trail ran along a ridge for a while, then dipped into a wide basin with a small stream at the bottom. The basin was surrounded by tall pines and maples, and the ground was soft with years of needles and leaves. I liked it because it always felt secluded, like a pocket of stillness cut off from the rest of the world. I hiked in late afternoon, the air crisp and dry, my boots scuffing through patches of fallen leaves. The light was soft and golden, filtering sideways through the thinning canopy. I could smell the faint musk of damp earth and the sharp tang of pine resin. The air had that unmistakable cool bite that told me the season was shifting toward colder nights. When I reached the basin, I dropped my pack and set up camp. The tent went up easy, staked firmly against the chance of wind. I laid out my bag and pad inside, checked my little stove, and gathered some kindling for a fire. By the time I had everything sorted, the light was fading fast, so I lit the fire and boiled some water for noodles. Sitting there, eating out of the pot with my metal spoon, I felt the tension of the week slide off me. The fire popped softly, sending sparks drifting upward, and the woods around me settled into that deep quiet that only comes after sunset. The first part of the night was peaceful. I sat by the fire for a while, sipping from my water bottle, watching the flames dance. Every so often I'd hear the faint scuttle of a mouse in the leaves, or the distant hoot of an owl. It all felt normal, the kind of night I'd wanted. It must have been around 10 when I finally doused the fire down to glowing coals and crawled into the tent. I lay in my bag, listening to the night, letting the steady rhythm of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves lull me towards sleep. At some point later, I couldn't say exactly when, I woke. It wasn't sudden, like a noise had snapped me out of sleep, more like my body had decided something wasn't quite right. I opened my eyes into the darkness of the tent, ears straining. For a long moment, All I heard was the normal stillness of the woods. Then there was a sound behind me. It was faint at first, just the soft crunch of something moving through the leaves. Slow, deliberate steps, not the quick, random rustle of a raccoon or squirrel, but heavier, more measured. My chest tightened as I held my breath, listening. The steps grew closer, circling toward the backside of my tent, so close that I could picture the weight of something pressing the earth down inches away from where my head lay. And then it happened. A cough, not a polite little animal sound, not the bark of a fox or the snort of a deer. This was deep, rough, hacking, the kind of noise you'd expect from a grown man clearing his throat after a long drag of a cigarette. It came from only feet away, right at the thin wall of fabric separating me from whatever was out there. My body locked up instantly. Every instinct screamed that someone was standing right behind me. I was alone in the woods, miles from anyone, and I knew without a doubt that no human voice should have been there. The sound was so close, so sudden, that my heart slammed against my ribs like it was trying to break out. I didn't move, not a finger, not a breath. I lay there frozen, staring into the dark, every muscle coiled tight. My mind spun in 1,000 directions at once. Who could it be? Why would someone be out here? Was I being watched? Seconds dragged like hours. My ears strained for any hint of movement, any follow-up to that awful cough. Then I heard it. A sharp stomp, the rustle of leaves, and the sudden explosive crash of something bounding away through the underbrush. Hoofs pounding, branches snapping, the sound fading into the distance. I finally let out the breath I'd been holding, my chest aching from how long I'd clenched it. My hands were trembling so hard I had to press them against my stomach to keep still. It had been a deer. I knew it then, even before I unzipped the tent in the pale light of dawn to find the hoofprints circling my camp. But in that moment, when the cough rattled the night air just feet behind me, I was sure I wasn't alone. It hadn't sounded like an animal. It had sounded human, so human it still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I didn't sleep much after that. I lay awake, every small sound magnified, waiting for another cough, another step, anything to confirm what my brain told me. But nothing else came. The woods slowly quieted again, and eventually dawn crept in, painting the trees in pale gray light. When I stepped out of the tent, I found the prints right away. Clear, sharp impressions in the damp earth, looping close around where I'd been sleeping. I followed them a little way, and they led off toward the ridge, vanishing into the thick brush. No doubt about it, it had been a deer, probably a curious one, sneaking close to investigate, until the smoke or scent of me spooked it and it coughed. Looking at the tracks, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. On one hand, I knew the truth now. I hadn't been stalked by some stranger, hadn't been seconds away from a confrontation in the dark. On the other hand, the memory of that cough stayed lodged in me. If I hadn't seen the prints, I might never have believed it wasn't a person. The rest of the morning I spent breaking camp, moving slowly, glancing over my shoulder more than I usually do. My nerves were still raw, stretched thin by the adrenaline of the night before. Even as I hiked back toward the trailhead, every snapping branch made me stiffen. Every shadow between the trees felt like it could hold someone watching. Back home, safe again with walls around me, I laughed when I told the story. The image of a deer sneaking up, trying to be quiet, only to cough like a clumsy cartoon character. It was funny in the daylight, retold over coffee. But out there in the woods, in the dark silence of midnight, it had been anything but funny. It had been one of the most chilling moments I've ever experienced. And that's what sticks with me even now. The woods are full of harmless things that can still shake you to the core. A cough, a shadow, a footstep too close in the dark. They remind you how fragile your sense of safety really is. That night, a deer gave me one of those reminders. And though I can laugh about it now, I'll never forget how real the fear felt when I thought I wasn't alone. I've camped a lot of nights in the woods, but there's one night in particular that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. The strange thing is, nothing actually attacked me, nothing supernatural appeared, and no one jumped out of the trees. But the woods have this way of making the smallest sound feel enormous. And that night I learned just how thin the line is between confidence and raw, unshakable fear. It was late September, one of those weekends when summer still clings during the day, but the nights dip cold enough to make you wish for an extra layer. I'd picked a patch of state forest I'd been through before on day hikes, but never stayed overnight. The map showed a few backcountry sites along a long ridgeline, and I figured it would be a good solo trip to clear my head. I parked at a small gravel lot in the afternoon, shouldered my pack, and started down the trail. The forest was already quiet, that early fall hush where a lot of the birds have migrated but winter hasn't fully arrived. The crunch of leaves under my boots felt loud in the silence. The air smelled faintly sweet, the way it does when leaves first start to rot, mixed with the resin of pine and the dampness of earth. The hike was about 4 miles, not too bad, but enough to make me sweat under the weight of my pack. I passed through stretches of dense hardwood, the canopy filtering the sunlight down into shifting patches, then through sections of tall pines where the ground was carpeted in brown needles. Every so often I'd catch the flick of a deer's white tail bounding away, or the sudden chatter of a squirrel scolding me from a branch. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was angling low. The site was just a small flat clearing tucked back from the trail, barely big enough for a tent and a fire pit ringed with stones. It overlooked a slope that dropped down into a tangle of brush and trees, with another ridge rising in the distance. The place felt secluded, perfect for the night. I dropped my pack, stretched, and got to work. The tent went up quick, just a 2-man dome I'd used a dozen times. I staked it down, unrolled my sleeping pad and bag inside, then gathered some sticks for a fire. There was plenty of dry wood scattered around, and soon I had a small blaze going, the flames snapping and sending sparks up into the air. Dinner was simple ramen with a pouch of tuna stirred in. I sat cross-legged near the fire, slurping noodles, watching the light fade from the trees. The world dimmed in layers. First the sunlight slipped from the ridge opposite me, then the clearing darkened, then the fire became the brightest thing around. The air cooled fast, and I pulled my jacket tighter, holding my hands close to the flames. As the forest shifted into night, I started to notice the little sounds. Crickets chirping steady in the brush, a faint rustle of leaves every now and then, the distant call of an owl, low and echoing. Nothing unusual, but out there, those noises feel different when you're alone. They remind you that you're surrounded by life you can't see. By 10, the fire burned low. I poured some water over the coals, watched them hiss and fade to steam, then crawled into my tent. Inside, I wriggled into my sleeping bag, listened to the nylon crackle as I shifted, and settled in. The dark pressed close. My eyelids grew heavy. I don't know how long I slept before it happened. Maybe a couple hours. But suddenly, I was awake. At first I thought it was nothing. Just that strange sense you get when your body decides it's time to be alert. I lay still, heart beating a little faster, ears straining. Then I heard it. A sharp, forceful expulsion of air. Not quite a cough, not quite a snort. It was a harsh blow, like someone had sucked in a lungful of air and blasted it out in one violent burst. The sound came from just beyond my tent, maybe 10 feet away. Every muscle in my body locked tight. My mind jumped straight to a person. That's what it sounded like. Some guy standing in the woods at midnight, trying to get my attention. I held my breath, staring up into the dark, heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then it came again. A heavy, deliberate blow. Air forced out in a sudden rush. I'd spent enough nights outside to know this wasn't just some random noise. It was deliberate. A signal. My brain scrambled through possibilities. Human? Animal? What kind of animal makes a sound that close to a human cough? Another blow, this one closer. My skin prickled cold. I imagined someone standing there in the black trees, watching my tent, waiting for me to unzip it. I pictured a hunter, maybe, or some guy strung out and wandering the forest. The thought made my stomach lurch. Then I heard movement, leaves crunching, a step, then another. The sound circled slowly, deliberate, as if whatever it was walking a perimeter around my camp. I stayed frozen. My sleeping bag felt like a trap, holding me down. My knife was in my pack, out of reach. The only thing between me and the outside was a thin wall of nylon. The blows kept coming, spaced out. Each one made my heart leap. I'd never heard anything like it before. Wet, explosive, like a sneeze crossed with a cough. Finally, after what felt like forever, there was a crash of movement. Something bounded away through the brush, crashing down the slope with heavy steps. I lay there stiff, waiting, ears straining. The forest went quiet again, except for the steady rhythm of crickets. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay wide-eyed, heart thudding, listening to every rustle. At first light, I crawled out, body stiff, eyes gritty from lack of sleep. Mist hung low in the clearing, and the world felt damp and still. I walked the edge of the site, scanning the ground. That's when I saw the tracks. Hooves, clear as day. Deer. Relief hit me hard, mixed with something else. Unease. I realized then what I'd heard. Later I'd learn it's called blowing. Deer do it when they sense danger, when something feels off. They expel a sharp burst of air through their nostrils, loud and violent, to alert others. It wasn't some man standing out there coughing. It was a deer warning the rest of its kind about me. But here's the thing. Lying in that tent, not knowing, it had sounded human. Too human. In the dead of night, with nothing but thin fabric between me and the woods, it had felt like something else entirely. I packed up slow that morning, nerves still jangling. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I kept glancing over my shoulder, ears tuned sharp to the woods around me. In daylight, it all looked ordinary, just trees, just birds, just the forest doing what it always does. But I knew how it had felt only hours earlier, how quickly your mind can betray you when you don't know what you're hearing. That night taught me something important. Out there, it doesn't take much to unravel your sense of safety. Sometimes all it takes is a sound you can't place, a sound too close, too human. My brain had filled in the blanks with the worst possibilities, because fear always chooses the darkest path. I laugh now when I tell the story. It was just a deer, I say smiling, shaking my head, but I also tell the truth, that in the moment, it was one of the scariest experiences of my life. Because I didn't know. Because for long, tense minutes, I was sure something stood outside my tent, watching, waiting, breathing. And even now, when I'm alone in the woods at night, sometimes I remember that sound. The harsh, violent blow of air, and I feel that fear rise again, raw and sharp. The woods are alive with signals we don't always understand. That night, I got one meant for deer, and it rattled me to the core.